The cabin stood where it had always stood, tucked into the shoulder of the Adirondack Mountains, like a secret kept between the pines and the sky. Silas Weatherby had built it with his own hands 43 years prior, in the summer of 1852, when his back was still straight and his wife still breathed. Now, in the autumn of 1895, he returned to it as one returns to a grave, with reverence, with resignation, and with the understanding that some places hold more of us than we hold of them. The train from Albany had deposited him at the mountain station just after noon, and he'd hired a local boy with a wagon to transport his trunk the final 8 miles. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, had grown increasingly quiet as they climbed the rutted logging road, and when they reached the clearing, he'd refused Silas's invitation to come inside for water. "My pa says there's something wrong with the air up here," the boy had muttered, unhitching Silas's trunk with more haste than care. "Says it makes people peculiar." Silas had paid him an extra quarter anyway, and watched the wagon disappear back down the mountain, swallowed by the forest like a stone dropped into deep water. Then he'd turn to face his exile. The cabin was smaller than he remembered, though memory was a liar in matters of scale and significance. Single-room construction, with a sleeping loft accessible by ladder, a stone fireplace that dominated the eastern wall, and windows that looked out onto a world of endless green, punctuated by the occasional gray tooth of granite pushing through the soil. He'd installed glass in those windows himself, real glass from New York City, carried up the mountain in crates packed with straw. Martha had insisted on it. "I won't live like a pioneer," she'd said, though they'd been pioneers in every way that mattered. The door resisted at first. The wood had swollen with decades of mountain humidity, but yielded with a groan that sounded almost relieved, as if the cabin had been holding its breath for 40 years. Inside, dust clothed everything in gray velvet. Silas set his trunk down and surveyed the archaeology of his younger life. The furniture remained, the table he'd planed from a local oak, the 3 chairs, one for him, one for Martha, one for the child who'd never come. The narrow bed frame in the loft still holding a mattress whose straw filling had long since settled into the memory of their bodies. On the mantel above the fireplace, a daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame showed a couple whose youth embarrassed him. The man in the photograph stood with the rigid posture of someone unaccustomed to being observed, while the woman beside him seemed barely tethered to the earth, as if the camera's long exposure had failed to fully capture her presence. Silas lifted the frame and wiped the glass with his sleeve. Martha stared back at him with eyes that knew something he didn't, had always known, would always know. "Well," he said aloud, his voice strange in the stillness, "I've come back." The cabin did not answer, but then again he hadn't expected it to. Not yet. He spent the remainder of that first day in the practical rituals of habitation. He swept the floors with a broom of bundled twigs, shook out the mattress and replaced its covering with fresh linens from his trunk, cleared the ash from the fireplace and laid a new fire, primed the pump at the sink until water, rust-colored at first, then clear, sputtered into the basin. He found the old root cellar door set into the floor beneath the table, and when he lifted it, the smell that rose up was of earth and thyme and the potatoes they'd stored there in 1853, probably rotted now to black liquid in the darkness below. He did not go down to check. By evening, he had made the cabin livable, or at least survivable. He'd brought provisions from Albany, coffee, flour, salt pork, dried beans, a wheel of hard cheese, tobacco for his pipe. And he arranged these on the shelves Martha had insisted on, though she'd never had much chance to fill them. The mountain had not been kind to her constitution. The mountain had not been kind at all. As twilight pressed against the windows, Silas lit the kerosene lamp and sat at the table with a tin plate of cold salt pork and hard bread. He'd forgotten to soak the beans. Tomorrow he'd remember. Tomorrow there would be time for everything. He ate slowly, methodically, the way a man eats when eating is simply a mechanical necessity and not a pleasure. At 71 years old, Silas had lost most of his teeth and much of his taste for food. What remained was the habit of maintenance, of fueling a body that persisted in its functions despite his growing indifference to its persistence. Outside, the forest began its evening song. Insects first, then birds settling for the night, then other things, rustlings and snappings, and the occasional cry of something caught or catching. Silas had forgotten how loud the wilderness could be, how it filled every silence with its own urgent communication. In Albany, where he'd spent the past 3 decades in a narrow boarding house on State Street, the nights had been different. Human noise, carriage wheels, distant factory whistles, the arguments of his neighbors bleeding through thin walls. He'd grown accustomed to that particular hell. This hell was older, more honest. When full darkness came, he lit his pipe and sat in the chair by the fireplace, watching the flames gnaw at the wood. The fire popped and hissed, and shadows moved across the walls in ancient patterns. He thought about the letter that had arrived 6 weeks ago, the one that had precipitated this return to the mountains. "Dear Mr. Weatherby," it had read in the cramped handwriting of a rural lawyer. "This is to inform you that the estate of your late wife's cousin, Nathaniel Burton, has been settled, and it is his wish that the property formerly in his possession, including the cabin on the north face of Mount Sentinel, should revert to you as sole heir of the Burton-Weatherby line. The property is now yours, free and clear, with all taxes paid through the end of the century. It is Mr. Burton's expressed hope, recorded in his final testament, that you might find some use for this place in your declining years." Declining years. The phrase had struck him as both accurate and offensive, but Burton had been right about one thing. Silas had nowhere else to go. His position as a clerk in the shipping office had been eliminated in the spring. Consolidation, they'd called it, though the word was just a polite way of saying he'd become obsolete. His savings amounted to less than $200. The boarding house would consume that in 6 months, and then what? The poorhouse? The charity ward of the Albany hospital, where men went to die in rows like plants in a garden? No. Better to die here, in a place that held at least the memory of something that had mattered, even if that something had been brief and brutal and had ended with Martha's fever-bright eyes staring at the ceiling beams while the mountain winter howled outside. Silas smoked his pipe down to ash, knocked the dottle into the fire, and climbed the ladder to the loft. The mattress received him like an old friend, and despite his expectations of insomnia in this strange familiar place, sleep came quickly, dropping over him like a heavy curtain. He dreamed, though he would not remember the content of the dream. Only the feeling of it would remain, the sense of something waiting, patient as stone, for him to settle fully into the silence. The days acquired a rhythm, as days in isolated places will. Silas rose with the dawn, started the fire, made coffee in the battered pot, ate his simple breakfast, standing at the window while the forest emerged from darkness into gray light and then into the golden illumination of autumn morning. After breakfast, he worked. There was always work. 40 years of abandonment had given the cabin's structure a tenuous quality, as if it were only the memory of a cabin, rather than the thing itself. He patched the roof where shingles had rotted away, replaced boards in the porch that had succumbed to dry rot, re-chinked gaps in the log walls where the original mud had crumbled. He worked slowly, with the careful attention of a man who had nothing but time, and found a kind of meditation in the labor. By the end of the first week, he'd restored the cabin to functionality. By the end of the second week, he'd improved it beyond its original state, adding a second shelf in the kitchen area, repairing the loft railing that had always been dangerously loose, even installing a lock on the door, though what he imagined locking out or in, he couldn't have said. The work was good. The work kept his hands busy and his mind focused on immediate, solvable problems. But in the spaces between tasks, in the moments when he paused to rest or to eat or simply to look out at the forest, something else crept in. It began with the silence. Not that the mountain was ever truly silent. The forest maintained its constant chorus of wind and wing and branch. But beneath that surface noise, or perhaps through it, Silas began to perceive an absence, a quality of nullity that seemed to emanate from the cabin itself. It was as if the building were a hollow tooth, and he, the nerve exposed within it, sensitive to every shift in atmospheric pressure. He found himself listening, not for anything specific, but listening with an intensity that left him exhausted by evening, listening to the way the wind moved through the pines, listening to the settling sounds of the cabin's old bones adjusting to his renewed presence, listening to the silence between sounds, the gaps where something should be but wasn't. On the 9th day, while mending a section of the porch, he realized he hadn't seen another human being since the wagon boy had departed. The nearest settlement was 6 miles down the mountain, a collection of logging families and subsistence farmers who, according to Burton's lawyer, kept largely to themselves and rarely ventured up the mountain trails. Silas had provisions enough for 2 months. He'd brought books, a water-damaged Bible, a collection of Poe's tales, a treatise on agriculture that he'd owned since his youth. He had tobacco. He had work. He had everything a man needed to live. Yet the isolation pressed on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. In Albany, he'd been alone but surrounded. Here, he was simply alone, with an emphasis that seemed to grow heavier each day. That evening, as he prepared his dinner, beans finally properly soaked and stewed with salt pork, he heard a sound from the loft. It was a small sound, hardly worth noticing, a soft thump as if something light had fallen or been placed down with care. Silas paused in his stirring wooden spoon suspended above the pot and listened. Nothing. The wind, he told himself, a branch brushing against the roof, a squirrel in the eaves, the cabin settling. All old buildings made sounds, particularly wooden ones, particularly in the temperature shifts between day and night. But the sound had come from inside. He was certain of it. He set down the spoon and climbed the ladder to the loft, his knees protesting the ascent. The space above was exactly as he'd left it that morning, the mattress made with tight corners, his spare clothes folded in the trunk at the foot of the bed, the small window that looked out over the descending forest, clean and closed. Nothing was out of place. Nothing had fallen. Nothing was there that shouldn't be there. He descended and returned to his beans, but his appetite had diminished. He ate mechanically, forcing the food down, and afterwards sat by the fire with a book open on his lap, not reading, just listening. The sound did not repeat that night, but its absence was somehow worse than its occurrence. Because now he was waiting for it. Now he was listening for it in every creak and whisper of the cabin's nighttime language. At midnight he finally climbed to bed and lay awake in the darkness, watching the shadows cast by the banked fire dance across the underside of the roof. Sleep, when it came, was thin and troubled, full of half-dreams that dissolved into waking without clear boundaries between the states. The next morning he found the first letter. It was tucked into the binding of the Bible, which he'd left on the table the previous night. He didn't remember putting anything in the Bible. He was certain he hadn't. Yet there it was, a single sheet of paper, folded once, covered in handwriting he recognized immediately, despite the decades that separated him from it. Martha's handwriting, Martha's words. "My dearest Silas," the letter began, in the elaborate script she'd learned at the finishing school in Boston. "I am writing this from my bed, where the fever has placed me these 3 days past. Dr. Harriman says it is only a catarrh, nothing serious, but I feel the weight of something else upon me, something he cannot name or cure. The cabin is so very quiet when you are out at your work, and I find myself listening to it, to the way it breathes and settles, and I think sometimes that it is listening back." Silas's hands began to shake. He set the letter on the table and stepped back from it as if it were a living thing, a snake that might strike. This was impossible. Martha had been dead for 43 years, buried in the plot beside the church in the settlement below, her stone carved with the words, "In God's grace, she rests." He had written no letters to himself. He had brought nothing of Martha's with him from Albany, had left all her possessions, her clothes, her jewelry, her personal effects, with her sister in Boston after the funeral. He hadn't seen this letter in decades, hadn't thought of it in decades, but he recognized it. He remembered it now with the sickening clarity of a wound reopened. She had written it during that final winter, during the illness that would kill her by March. He had found it after her death, tucked into her Bible, this Bible, and had read it once, wept over it once, and then had forced himself never to think of it again because the grief was more than a young man could carry and continue living. How had it come back? How was it here? Silas picked up the letter again with trembling fingers and continued reading. Sometimes I hear footsteps in the loft when you are downstairs, and footsteps below when I am resting above. I have told myself these are only the sounds of the wood responding to temperature, but I am less certain of this than I wish to be. Last night I woke in darkness and saw a figure standing at the window, looking out. I thought at first it was you, unable to sleep, but then I reached across the bed and found you beside me, deep in slumber. When I looked again at the window, the figure was gone, though I had not heard it move, and I do not believe it was ever truly there. The fever, of course, the fever makes phantoms of shadows. The letter continued for another half-page, Martha's handwriting growing shakier toward the end, her words becoming less coherent, more fevered. It concluded with a line that struck Silas like a physical blow. "I fear I am not alone here, my love. I fear the cabin has other tenants, and they do not wish me well." Silas folded the letter and placed it back in the Bible, then closed the Bible and set it on the highest shelf, as if elevation might protect him from its contents. His breath came in short gasps. His heart hammered against his ribs with the irregular rhythm that had concerned the doctor in Albany, the doctor who had warned him about excitement and exertion and all the things that could kill a man of his age. He forced himself to sit, to breathe slowly, to think rationally. There were explanations. He had brought the Bible from Albany. Perhaps the letter had been in it all along, and he'd simply forgotten, his old mind playing tricks. Perhaps he'd found it while packing and slipped it into the Bible without conscious thought, and then forgotten the action immediately, the way old people forget things. Yes, that must be it. But even as he constructed this explanation, he knew it was false, knew it in his bones, in the way one knows a lie even when it's prettily told. He hadn't brought this letter. This letter had been left behind with all the other remnants of Martha's brief life. He was certain of it, which meant someone else had placed it in the Bible. Someone else had been in the cabin. Someone was here, even now, watching him construct his rationalizations. Silas stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud. He went to the door and opened it, stepping out onto the porch into the cold mountain air. The forest stretched before him in all directions, a sea of pine and hardwood wearing its autumn colors like ceremonial dress. Nothing moved except the wind through the branches. No figure lurked among the trees. No footprints marked the dirt around the cabin except his own from his morning routine. He was alone, completely, utterly alone. So why did he feel so watched? The letters appeared with increasing frequency over the following days. Silas would find them in impossible places, tucked into the pages of Poe's stories, slipped under his plate at breakfast, folded beneath his pillow when he retired at night. All were in Martha's handwriting. All were fragments of correspondence from that last winter, pieces of the final weeks before her death. He tried to construct a rational explanation. Perhaps Burton, before his death, had found these letters somewhere in the cabin and had been placing them around the space before his own passing, and they were only now revealing themselves as Silas disturbed corners that hadn't been touched in years. But this explanation collapsed under scrutiny. Burton had died in Connecticut, in a hospital, and had not visited the cabin in decades. The lawyer's letter had been clear about that. Perhaps someone was playing a cruel joke. A local who knew the cabin's history, who had stolen into the space while Silas slept or worked outside. But the cabin's isolation made this unlikely, and besides, who would have access to Martha's letters? Who would know their content? The alternative, that something else was happening, something that violated the comfortable boundaries of natural law, Silas refused to consider. He was a rational man. He had lived through the transformation of America from an agricultural backwater to an industrial power. He had seen the railroad conquer distance, seen the telegraph annihilate time, seen electricity tame darkness itself. The world operated according to principles that could be understood, measured, exploited. There was no room in such a world for the supernatural. Yet the letters continued to appear, and with them other signs of presence. Objects moved, not dramatically. Nothing flew across the room or shattered against walls, but subtly, disturbingly. The daguerreotype on the mantel would be facing a different direction. His pipe, left on the table, would be on the windowsill. The rocking chair in the corner, which he never used, would be positioned differently, as if someone had sat in it and then pushed it slightly off-center when rising. And the sounds. God, the sounds. They came mostly at night, after he'd extinguished the lamp and climbed to the loft. Footsteps crossing the floor below, the scrape of the table being moved, the creak of the door opening and closing, though in the morning it would be barred from the inside, exactly as he'd left it. Once he heard what sounded unmistakably like weeping, a woman's soft, steady crying that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from inside the walls themselves. He told himself these were auditory illusions, the product of an aging mind stressed by isolation. He increased his activities during the day, chopping more wood than he needed, walking miles along the mountain trails until exhaustion left him too tired for imagination. But the sounds persisted, growing bolder, occurring now even in daylight hours. On the 16th day he found her dress. It was hanging from a peg near the door, the peg where she used to hang her shawl, and it was the blue calico she'd worn during her illness, the one she'd died in. He remembered it precisely, the small print of white flowers, the way the fabric had hung loose on her wasted frame those final weeks, the blood she'd coughed into the handkerchief she kept tucked in the pocket. Silas stared at the dress for what might have been minutes or hours. Time had become unreliable. The dress moved slightly in a draft he couldn't feel, swaying as if still inhabited by the body it had once clothed. He should burn it. He should take it down and throw it in the fire and watch it reduced to ash. But he couldn't move, couldn't touch it, because touching it would require acknowledging it was real, was actually there, and acknowledging that would mean accepting that everything he believed about the nature of reality was suspect. "Martha," he whispered, his voice cracking on the syllables of her name. The dress swayed, the cabin held its breath, and in the silence that followed, Silas heard very clearly from the loft above the sound of someone lying down on the bed, the sound of the mattress accepting weight, of fabric rustling, of a body settling into familiar position. Silas fled. He stumbled out of the cabin into the afternoon light, not bothering to close the door behind him, and walked. He walked without direction or destination, following the deer trails that wound through the forest, pushing through underbrush that tore at his clothes and skin, climbing over fallen logs that a younger man would have easily vaulted. He walked until the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, until the forest grew dark around him, and he realized he had no idea where he was or how to return. Panic seized him then, true, primitive panic that flooded his system with the useless energy of flight. He was 71 years old, alone in wilderness, with darkness coming and the temperature already dropping toward freezing. He had no matches, no coat, no supplies. If he didn't find his way back to the cabin before full night, he would die out here, and that death would not be kind. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was fleeing the cabin to avoid confronting the impossible, only to find himself in a situation where the cabin represented his only hope of survival. He forced himself to stop, to breathe, to think. The sun was setting in the west, painting the sky above the trees in shades of orange and crimson. If he kept the sunset at his back and climbed upward, he would eventually intersect with the logging road, and from there could orient himself. The cabin was on the north face of the mountain. North. He needed to go north. It took him 2 hours of climbing in increasing darkness to find the cabin again, and by the time he emerged into the clearing, he was scratched, bleeding from a dozen small wounds, and shivering uncontrollably. The cabin's windows glowed with warm light. He had left the lamp burning, and smoke rose from the chimney in a straight column in the still air. Smoke. But he hadn't lit a fire before fleeing. He was certain he hadn't. Silas approached the cabin slowly, his legs trembling with fatigue and something else. The door stood open, exactly as he'd left it. Light spilled out onto the porch. From inside came a sound he recognized, the rocking chair moving in its slow, steady rhythm. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. He climbed the porch steps, stood in the AA doorway, looked inside. The rocking chair moved, though no one sat in it. The fire burned in the fireplace, freshly stoked, flames dancing around new logs he hadn't placed there. On the table, a place had been set, a single tin plate, a cup of water, a portion of salt pork and beans still steaming, as if just served. And in the rocking chair's shadow, cast by the firelight against the far wall, Silas saw the silhouette of a seated figure, distinct and unmistakable, moving in perfect synchronization with the chair's rhythm. Martha? His voice was barely a whisper, barely there at all. The rocking stopped. The shadow remained, frozen in mid-motion. And then, from the loft above, came Martha's voice, or something wearing Martha's voice like an ill-fitting garment. "You came back," she said. "After all this time, you finally came back." Silas did not sleep that night. He couldn't bring himself to climb to the loft, not after hearing that voice, that thing that sounded like Martha, but carried in it something wrong, something that made his skin crawl and his heart race with instinctive animal terror. Instead, he sat at the table with the lamp turned high, watching the shadows and waiting for morning. The voice did not speak again. The rocking chair sat still. The shadow on the wall had vanished when he'd finally found the courage to turn and look at it directly. But the presence remained. He felt it like a pressure behind his eyes, a weight in the air itself, as if the cabin's atmosphere had grown denser, harder to breathe. When gray light finally began to seep through the windows, Silas stood on legs, gone numb from sitting, and made coffee with shaking hands. He needed to think, needed to decide what to do. The rational part of his mind, the part that had been trained by decades of ledgers and shipping manifests and the concrete realities of commerce, insisted that he was suffering a psychological break, that isolation and grief and the return to this place of trauma had fractured something essential in his sanity. But the irrational part, the part that had been growing stronger since the first letter appeared, knew better. Something was happening in this cabin. Something had always been happening in this cabin, since he and Martha had first built it, or perhaps even before, when this clearing had been nothing but wilderness and the cabin existed only as possibility in the future. He drank his coffee and watched the sun rise and tried to remember what Martha had been like before the cabin had changed her. She'd been vivacious, hadn't she? Full of life and laughter, excited about their adventure in the mountains, their plan to build a new life, away from the suffocating proprieties of Boston society. She'd packed her trunks with books and good linens and the silver-framed daguerreotype, and had made the journey north with the enthusiasm of a child embarking on a grand expedition. But the mountains had not welcomed her the way they'd do Bonaparte. Welcomed Silas? From the first night in the cabin, she'd been uneasy. "It's too quiet," she'd complained. "I can hear my own heartbeat in the silence." She'd had trouble sleeping, had developed nervous habits, checking and rechecking the door, standing at the windows for long periods, staring out at the forest, starting at every sound the cabin made. Silas had dismissed it as adjustment, had assured her she would acclimate, had promised that by spring she would wonder how she'd ever lived any other way. But spring had never come for Martha. Winter had taken her, or something working through winter had taken her, and by the time the doctor had made his way up the mountain through the last of the snow, there had been nothing to do but confirm what Silas already knew. His wife was dead, and he was alone. He'd buried her in the settlement cemetery and left the mountain the same day, unable to spend another hour in the cabin that had killed her. He'd never intended to return, had spent 43 years not returning, building a new life in Albany, taking a job that required no emotion and no connection, living in a boarding house where he spoke to no one and no one spoke to him. And now he was back, and Martha, or something pretending to be Martha, was back as well. The question was, what did it want? Over the following days, Silas attempted to establish a kind of détente with whatever shared the cabin with him. He maintained his routines, continued to cook his meals, and tend the fire and work on small repairs. But he did these things with a consciousness of being observed, of performing for an audience of one. He stopped fleeing when strange things occurred. When objects moved, he simply moved them back. When sounds came from the loft, he acknowledged them with a nod, as one might acknowledge a roommate in a boarding house. He even began to speak aloud, directing his words to the empty air, telling Martha, for he had begun to think of the presence as Martha, regardless of what it actually was, about his life in Albany, about the shipping office and the boarding house and the long gray decades that had brought him back here. And the presence responded, not with words usually, but with signs. The rocking chair would move when he talked about lonely evenings by the boarding house window. The daguerreotype would be positioned prominently when he mentioned his regrets. Objects from their brief life together began to appear, her hairbrush on the shelf, her sewing basket by the chair, her books arranged on the windowsill. It was almost companionable in a grotesque way. Silas found himself looking forward to these small communications, these acknowledgments that he was not entirely alone. His fear didn't disappear. He still felt that pressure, that weight in the air, that sense of something fundamentally wrong. But it became background noise, a constant hum he learned to live with. Until the night he woke to find her standing beside the bed. She was exactly as he remembered her from those final days. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, her skin with the waxy translucence of terminal illness, her hair hanging lank and lifeless around her shoulders. She wore the blue calico dress, and in her hands she held a handkerchief spotted with old blood. "Silas," she said, and her voice was the rustling of dead leaves, the whisper of wind through empty rooms. "Why did you leave me here?" He couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only lie there paralyzed while this apparition, this ghost, this hallucination, this thing, stared down at him with eyes that held no life, but also no mercy. "I was so cold," she continued. "In the ground I was so very cold. And you left me there. You went away and lived your life and forgot me, and I was cold." "I didn't forget," Silas managed, his voice a croak. "I never forgot." "Liar." The word fell like a stone into still water. "You forgot me before I was even dead. You were already planning your escape, already thinking of Albany and the life you would have without me. I felt you pulling away even as the fever took me. I died alone, Silas. Died while you were downstairs, while you couldn't bear to be in the same room with what I'd become. This was true. God help him, this was true. Those final days, he hadn't been able to look at her, had found excuses to be elsewhere, to chop wood, or check the traps, or ride down to the settlement for supplies they didn't need. He'd been 28 years old and terrified of death, and selfishly, shamefully relieved when it finally came and released him from the obligation of witnessing. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Sorry." She laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Sorry," as if that word could warm the grave, as if that word could fill the years. She leaned closer, and he smelled her. Not decay exactly, but absence, the smell of spaces where life had been and was no longer. Her hand, or the shadow of her hand, reached toward his face. "You came back," she said. "Finally, you came back. Now you can stay. Now we can both stay together, the way we always should have been." Her fingers touched his cheek, and Silas felt something drain out of him. Not blood, not breath, but something more essential. Warmth, vitality, the fundamental force that separated the living from the dead. He gasped, tried to pull away, but his body wouldn't respond. He was pinned in place by her touch, by her gaze, by the weight of 43 years of abandonment. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Die with me. It's so cold alone." Darkness crept in from the edges of his vision. His heart stuttered, skipped, nearly stopped. And in that moment, in the space between beats, Silas understood that Martha, whatever wore her face, was not asking. She was taking, was pulling him down into the dark place where she'd been waiting all these years, where she would always be waiting, patient as stone, cold as the mountain winter that had killed her. With the last of his strength, Silas whispered, "No." The word broke something. Martha's form flickered like a candle flame in wind, and her hand withdrew from his face. Silas gasped, air rushing back into lungs that had felt collapsed, blood surging back into veins that had been growing cold. He rolled away from her, fell from the bed to the floor of the loft, and scrabbled backward until his spine hit the wall. She stood there looking down at him, and her expression was no longer sorrowful. It was angry. It was hungry. "No?" she said. "You have no right to say no. You owe me your life, Silas Weatherby. You owe me every day you lived while I rotted in the ground." "You're not Martha." The words came from somewhere deep in Silas's chest, from a place he hadn't known still existed, a place that still held fight instead of resignation. "Martha is dead. Martha is at peace. You're something else." "Am I?" The figure tilted its head, and for a moment its face seemed to slip, to reveal something beneath that was neither human nor kind. "Perhaps I am Martha. Perhaps I'm what Martha became after 43 winters of waiting. Perhaps love curdles, Silas. Perhaps it turns to something else when left alone long enough." She moved closer, gliding rather than walking, and Silas felt that draining sensation again, that pulling at the core of him. He forced himself to his feet, holding the wall for support, and faced her. "If you're Martha," he said, "then you remember our wedding day. You remember what you said to me in the church in Boston, when the minister asked if you took me for your husband." The figure paused. "I said yes." "Before that? You said something before that, something only we knew." Silence. The figure's face flickered again, its features becoming less distinct, as if it were a drawing being slowly erased. "You can't remember," Silas continued, his voice growing stronger, "because you're not her. You're something that fed on her death, on her fear and pain and anger. You're something that lived in this cabin before we ever came here. Something that drove her mad those final weeks. Something that killed her and then wore her like a costume to try to kill me too." "Pretty speech," the thing said, and its voice was no longer Martha's at all, was instead something vast and cold and old. "But what does it matter? You're here now. You came back. You delivered yourself to me, and whether I'm your wife's ghost or something else entirely, the result will be the same. You will die in this cabin, just as she died, and I will feed on your fear and pain and loneliness, just as I fed on hers." The temperature in the loft dropped precipitously. Silas could see his breath now, white plumes in the air. The thing that had been Martha expanded, grew larger, its form becoming more shadow than substance, filling the space between floor and ceiling, pressing against him with the weight of malicious intention. "I've been here since before the trees," it said. "I've been here since the first humans looked up at this mountain and felt fear. I am the silence that drives men mad. I am the isolation that eats at the soul. I am the reason no one lives on this mountain, why the natives avoided this valley, why the loggers won't cut these trees, why your wife died raving." Silas's knees buckled, but he held himself upright through sheer will. His heart hammered against his ribs, painful and erratic. The doctor's warning echoed in his mind. Excitement, exertion, anything that stressed his damaged heart could kill him. He was dying anyway, had been dying by slow degrees for years. What did it matter if it happened now, here, facing this thing? But something in him refused to accept that ending. Something stubborn and human, and ultimately defiant. "You're a parasite," he said through chattering teeth. "You feed on fear because you have nothing of your own. You're empty. You're nothing but hunger wearing fear's face." The shadow surged toward him, and Silas felt its cold touch again, felt it reaching for his heart, for the vital spark that still kept him tethered to life. But this time, instead of pulling away, he leaned into it. He thought of Martha. Not the ghost, not the thing pretending to be her, but the real Martha, the woman who had laughed at his awkward courtship, who had insisted on glass windows and proper shelves, who had been afraid at the end, but had faced that fear with dignity, who had written in her letters about hearing the cabin breathe and knowing something was wrong but staying anyway because she loved him. He thought of the 43 years he'd spent in Albany, the gray parade of empty days, the slow suicide of a life unlived. He thought of the last letter, the one the thing had shown him, where Martha had written, "I fear the cabin has other tenants, and they do not wish me well." She had known, and she had stayed, and she had died, and he had run. "I'm sorry, Martha," Silas whispered, not to the thing in front of him, but to the memory of the woman he'd loved and failed. "I'm sorry I left you. I'm sorry I was too afraid to stay. But I'm not afraid anymore." It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that mattered. He was terrified, but he was also finished running. The shadow seemed to sense his shift, his acceptance. It paused, its edges rippling like disturbed water. And in that pause, Silas moved. He lunged for the ladder, descended with a speed that his old body shouldn't have been capable of, and reached the main room. The fire still burned in the fireplace, and beside it stood the can of kerosene he used for the lamp. He grabbed it, unscrewed the cap, and began splashing the fuel around the room, on the floor, on the walls, on the furniture that he and Martha had built together. The thing followed him down from the loft, its form now purely shadow, a darkness that moved independently of any light source. "What are you doing?" it demanded, and there was something new in its voice. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. "What I should have done 43 years ago," Silas said. He pulled a burning log from the fireplace, holding it like a torch. The heat seared his hand, but he didn't let go. "I'm ending this. I'm burning it down. If this cabin is your home, your source of power, then it needs to go." "You'll die," the shadow said. "The smoke will kill you before you can get out." "Yes," Silas agreed. He looked at the daguerreotype on the mantel, at the young couple staring out from behind the glass, and felt something in his chest crack open. "But at least I'll die doing something that matters." He touched the burning log to the kerosene-soaked floor. The flames spread faster than he'd expected, following the trails of fuel he'd laid, climbing the walls, reaching for the ceiling. Heat blossomed in the room, driving back the cold that the shadow had brought. Smoke began to fill the air, thick and black and choking. The shadow screamed, a sound that was not sound, that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the mind, and rushed at him. But the flame seemed to hinder it, to hold it back, as if fire possessed some quality anathema to its nature. It writhed and twisted, its form becoming chaotic, desperate. Silas stood in the center of the burning cabin, the smoke already making his lungs spasm, his heart already beginning to fail under the stress. But he smiled, because the thing was weakening, because the cabin was dying, because for the first time in 43 years he had chosen something over survival. Go back to the darkness, he told it. Go back to whatever hole spawned you. This place is done feeding you. The shadow gave one final shriek and collapsed inward, imploding like a building in reverse, and suddenly Silas was alone in the burning cabin. Truly alone, without presence or weight or watching eyes. He tried to walk toward the door, thinking perhaps he might make it out after all, but his legs wouldn't hold him. He collapsed near the threshold, the smoke filling his lungs, the heat cooking his skin, his heart giving its final irregular beats. As consciousness faded, he saw, or thought he saw, a figure standing in the doorway. Not the shadow, but Martha. The real Martha, young and whole, limned in light that had nothing to do with the fire. She was smiling. "You came back," she said, and this time her voice held only love. "You came back, and you set us both free." She reached out her hand, and Silas took it, and together they walked out of the burning cabin into a light that was soft and warm and welcoming. Behind them, the fire roared, consuming the cabin and everything in it, erasing 43 years of haunting in a cleansing conflagration that would burn through the night and into the next day, until nothing remained but ash and stone and the silence of the mountain. They found the body 3 days later when smoke was spotted from the settlement below, and a party of men finally ventured up the mountain to investigate. Silas Weatherby lay just inside the cabin's threshold, one hand stretched toward the door as if reaching for escape, the other curled against his chest. The fire had done its work thoroughly. The cabin was nothing but a charred frame. The roof collapsed, the walls reduced to carbonized logs that crumbled at a touch. The men who found him noticed several odd things. The first was that despite the severity of the fire, Silas's body bore fewer burns than expected, as if he'd died before the flames had truly reached him. The second was his expression, peaceful, almost serene, entirely wrong for a man who should have died in agony and terror. The third was the absence of certain items that should have survived the fire, the iron stove, the metal fittings, the glass from the windows. These had all somehow been reduced to slag or powder, as if the fire had burned far hotter than any normal conflagration. But the strangest thing was this. Scattered through the ruins, they found dozens of letters written in a woman's hand, completely untouched by the flames. The men gathered these up, reading them with increasing unease. They were love letters, fever dreams, diary entries, all written by Martha Burton Weatherby in the winter of 1853, all describing her growing conviction that something malevolent inhabited the cabin, that it was feeding on her fear, that it would kill her and then wait for her husband to return. The last letter, found clutched in Silas's unburned hand, read simply, "Forgive me, my love, for making you carry this weight alone. But thank you for coming back. Thank you for setting me free. We are both free now." The men looked at each other in the ruins of the cabin, in the silence of the mountain, and made a wordless agreement. They would report that Silas Weatherby had died in an accidental fire, likely caused by a kerosene lamp tipped over during the night. They would bury him next to his wife in the settlement cemetery. They would burn the letters without reading them to anyone else. And they would never speak of what they'd felt in that clearing, the sense of absence, of vacancy, as if something that had long occupied this space had finally departed, leaving behind a void that was slowly being filled with the ordinary sounds of wind and bird and branch. The cabin site was left as it was, the charred timbers allowed to rot and collapse and eventually be reclaimed by the forest. Within a decade, you'd have to know what you were looking for to find it at all. Within 2 decades, the forest had erased nearly every sign that human beings had ever tried to build anything in that clearing. But sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings, when the wind came down from the high peaks, the loggers and farmers in the settlement below would pause in their work and listen to the mountain. And they would swear they could hear something like laughter, not malicious, not hungry, but joyful, echoing through the valleys, faint and far away, like the sound of 2 people finally reunited after a long separation. The mountain kept its secrets, but it no longer held its ghosts. This story explores the intersection of grief, guilt, and genuine supernatural malevolence. Silas's return to the cabin represents his belated confrontation with abandonment and cowardice, themes common to the psychological horror of the Gilded Age, when rapid modernization left many feeling unmoored from traditional values and certainties. The entity in the cabin is deliberately ambiguous. It may be a genuine paranormal presence that fed on Martha's isolation and fear, or it may be the manifestation of Silas's unprocessed guilt creating its own terrible reality. The resolution, Silas's self-sacrifice to destroy the cabin, achieves a kind of redemption regardless of the entity's true nature. In choosing to act rather than flee, in choosing connection, even with death, over survival, Silas finally becomes the man he should have been 43 years earlier. The setting of the Gilded Age is significant. This was a period of tremendous change in America, when the old frontier was closing and a new industrial age was beginning. Silas represents a man caught between these eras, too modern to accept the supernatural at face value, but old enough to remember when the wilderness still held genuine mystery and terror. His arc is one of a reluctant return, not just to a place, but to a more fundamental human capacity for courage in the face of the unknown.